All right, so for the first session today, we'll let you warm up a little bit and really just talk about what kind of grants are appropriate for you all and things to strive to achieve in the future. And I guess I'll start with a raise of hands. Besides the faculty, how many people have ever put in any kind of grant application? So actually a lot of you have. Okay, so that's impressive. That's really impressive. And so you were way further than I was at your stage. I didn't even know what a grant bloody was. But we'll go over through some of the basics for you that have never put a grant in. For you that have, I encourage anyone to pipe in during this, particularly the faculty too. Many of you have experience applying to a lot of these grants, and so please pipe in, and certainly we can continue the discussion going forward. So I'm really going to focus mostly on like starting opportunities for grants. And then we'll also talk a little bit about like what people more mid-career and later career do within the world of emergency medicine, which maybe you already see at your shops, et cetera, but maybe you don't. And so we'll talk about that. For me, the place I started was actually internal funding. So, well, I should back up. I did a combined EMIM program, and during my 5th year, I had lots of time. It was easy electives for the most part, and so for some reason, I saw the opportunity for like the GEMSTAR R03 grant, which is funded by the NIH, but it's specific to geriatric emergency medicine. I'm like, oh, this looks really cool. I had this idea of a project doing, some ultrasound scanning in elderly patients, and I'm like, I just started on my own, didn't talk to a true mentor, and I found a geriatrician at our shop who was who I knew well, and was a really great doctor. Turns out he didn't know a thing about grants. And so I submitted this grant. It actually got scored, surprisingly, and like, I didn't even know what the score meant. I'm like, oh, well, that's not that good, and I didn't even resubmit this thing. And so another few years passed, and I'm like, oh, wait, I really should have actually resubmitted that grant. But I had like zero mentorship at the time. So eventually I talked to more people in my shop. I got more mentorship. And we had a wonderful internal funding opportunity for essentially a K award. K award is a career development award through the NIH, but this was an internally funded K award that provided some of the same support as like a NIH K award. And so I applied to that, and then things kind of got moving once. I got rejected once for that, but then the second round was able to get funding for that. So I would encourage all of you, as a first place, look internally. And there's a good chance that you may have either a pilot grant, maybe a career development grant, maybe et cetera. Let me see if I can move this down a bit. So look internally. I realized too that our institution, which isn't a huge institution, we actually have non-competitive pilot grants. So they set aside approximately $80,000 every year, and will give between $10,000 and $20,000 in a non-competitive manner. So as long as you're not the 9th person that applies for the award, and it looks reasonable, they're going to give you that pilot funding. So look into that. And we'll talk a little bit about why $10,000 may not sound very big, and it's not. It's not going to support a whole lot of your salary for you to have time. But we'll talk in a second about why that matters. The other one, you mentioned a bunch of the faculty here mentioned applying to SAEM Foundation. And so I encourage everyone here to consider that because you're already working on AIMS pages, and it's due in August. So you got a little bit of time here. And I know many of you are in the ARM course. I've told you all this before, but you have a dedicated grant specific to the ARM course that is for the current class as well as the prior classes that have done it. And so that's $25,000 with a smaller pool of people applying to it. But as you heard, there's a ton of different levels of funding through SAEM Foundation, and they're actually up to about $800,000 a year that the foundation is giving out to you all, really, within the organization. So August 1st is the deadline. Write that down. Get those AIMS page queued up, and it's coming around. So if you apply, if you get it in for August, potentially your funding would start in July of 2023 for the SAEM Foundation. And these are a couple examples of people that got it from this last cycle. Josh Lupton at OHSU received the research training grant. Unfortunately, a bunch of you probably can't see this in the back, but he got it on route and looking at anarrhythmics during cardiac arrest. That's an example of kind of the types, but really it could be a broad area of topic areas. And then one of our prior ARMed participants, Martin Casey, got the ARMed $25,000 grant. And there's a whole bunch more that were funded this past year. I didn't put the whole list here, but you can find it on the website. The reason I mentioned that no grant's too small, whether it's 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Oh, do you have a question?
Do you mind if I just say for
Yes, please, Bryn.
I'm the chair of the SAEM grants committee for this coming year, and we want to help you be successful with these grants. So please, if you have questions and you're not sure if your idea fits under one mechanism or another, if there's overlap, grants@saem.org, please send us an email. We are more than happy to help talk you through that, and just provide assistance in submitting a grant. As you'll hear today, is a big process, but we will try to make it as user-friendly as possible for you.
Thanks, Bryn. Yeah, and you'll hear over and over, probably today, but also throughout many meetings at SAM, that a lot of people that now are R01 funded and very successful, they started off with SAM Foundation grants or EMF Foundation grants or other small internal grants. And part of the reason that it's worth, even though you know like 10, 20, 50 isn't going to support your salary much, it's really building stepping stones so that the people that are going to give you large funding can see that, oh, you had a track record of success that's going to lead up to that large funding. And it's difficult, although it's not impossible, it's difficult sometimes to convince a review panel for an R01 level grant, which might give you $1.5 million over the next few years, to fund you if you don't have some kind of track record. And so this helps establish a track record and often is low-hanging fruit for that. So the other foundations that a lot of emergency medicine, these are just a smattering of them, but it's not uncommon that emergency physicians will have funding through, well, of course, EMF, which is Emergency Medicine Foundation, funds quite a bit of awards in this area. Their application deadline is usually kind of 6 months after SAM. AHA, there's a number of people that have AHA funding. Does anyone here have prior AHA funding among the faculty? Yeah, Scott does, right? And another one, Blue Cross Blue Shield, I know funds a fair amount. Actually, one of Scott's colleagues, Keith Coker at University of Michigan, has a fair amount of funding through them to do some quality improvement work within the state of Michigan. One of my colleagues, Martina, had funding during COVID from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to do to kind of mine Twitter data for underrepresented minorities and how they interpreted vaccine hesitancy, et cetera. So all kinds of opportunities within that. Another good example is during COVID, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation funded Mike Puskarich, who's a member of SAM, to do a study of losartan for COVID, which was actually just published not too long ago. Didn't show an efficacy, but was an important study to do and funded through Melinda and Gates Foundation. And then industry, I think a lot of us don't necessarily go there first, but industry does have lots of opportunities for investigator-initiated research as well. And so a large number of the major industry sponsors, even though we often think of them as they're going to run their own studies and we might participate and get a little money from that, there usually are ways that you can do investigator-initiated research. And so whether that's through things they advertise, or a lot of times it's not through opportunities that they advertise, but through contacts you may have within different industry sponsors. As an example, we worked with a sponsor that does cardiovascular research, and they didn't advertise anything about it, but the cardiologists I work closely with knew some of the leadership within this sponsor very well, and so we discussed how we wanted to roll out a new high-sensitivity troponin algorithm within our institution. And so they actually sponsored a lot of the data collection tools around actually analyzing the rollout, et cetera. But gave us full control of the data, full control of the, whatever, it's not really intellectual property, but full control of the interpretation and publication of everything. One of the pros is doing that grant, there wasn't a lot of writing with that grant. The last NIH R01 I put together had 140 pages. That grant was a total of about 12 pages. And the review cycle was 2 weeks rather than possibly 6 to 8 months for an NIH award. So there are some big pros to that. In this particular area, it didn't give us new access to specific, new devices or drugs or anything, but that is another reason why you might want to go to industry for an investigator-initiated grant because it may give you access to new devices or drugs that you need that industry sponsor for. The cons, this was a nice grant, but it still wasn't as big as a large NIH grant, particularly a large project grant. Secondly, there are conflict of interest issues. Now, this sponsor has been great. They're not asking to be put on the publication for it, but many sponsors may want a representative of their group to be on the publication, which raises conflict of interest. And either way, it is a sponsored project, and so there are going to be conflict of issues raised potentially. And we had very good control in this. Yes, Sarah?
So if you have an idea and it's something like a non-inferiority trial or something like that is going to be using drugs, can you go to the drug company and say, hey, I want to do this? Would you be willing to fund it?
Yes. So yes, you can, and many emergency physicians have done that. And then but sometimes it could be a bargain between whether you're going to have control as a truly investigator-initiated project or how much control the company is going to have. And typically that will all be sorted out early on when you create the contracts with your own legal team at your institution and the company. So in this specific case, we had an incredible amount of control over the data and the interpretation. However, in the past, for instance, a colleague in emergency medicine went to AstraZeneca wanting to do a trial on a particular drug that AstraZeneca makes, had control to some extent over the protocol, but then once the study got started, really lost control of it, and the study got shut down before this person wanted to actually shut it down, and then didn't really have full control of the publication rights to that. So there's a give and take there, and it kind of depends on how bad you want the money or how bad you want to use that particular drug or device or whatnot. The other thing is, and this is true for foundation funding as well, I wouldn't worry about this at your stage, but it does become an issue later on, is there's a thing called indirect and direct funding. Direct funding is the money that goes directly to you all so you can do the work you need to pay your salary, to pay your coordinator, blah, blah, blah. Indirects are kind of the overhead that will be given to your institution that's tied to your grant. So if you get an NIH award and you're a Harvard faculty, let's say you get $1 million in NIH funding of direct funding to you, Harvard's also going to get $700,000 on top of that from the NIH, which is the indirect funding to help cover overhead of, keep the lights on and everything else that helps that institution run. However, with foundations, a lot of times there'll be no indirects. So your institution doesn't get anything for that grant. Or sometimes it might be like 10% indirects, but it's going to be much lower than 70% or 50%. Industry, typically, it's also going to be much lower. Our institution really sticks around 25% indirects for industry. That's a common amount. But so again, your institution is not going to tell you not to get money from Pfizer or other sponsors, but they aren't going to get as much money as NIH. The other thing, again, getting back to the exact issue brought up, is that if you really want to have focus and full control of your research, you have to be cautious with industry sponsors. I'll give one other example. Is when I was first applying for an internal K award, I needed a specific device that Edwards made to do hemodynamic monitoring. And so, I needed two devices. I needed the device from Edwards that I didn't have the funding for. And so we asked them if they provided pro bono. We didn't ask them for money, just the devices. But man, amazing how much control they wanted over the research just for giving us these, they weren't even that expensive, these devices. And they bugged me for years about what the results and the publication and everything. It was unreal. So there are some, it doesn't always work as nicely as the current project we're working on. I think, and many of you know that within your institutions, either you're already doing it or many of your colleagues are being like site PIs for multi-center trials. And so a lot of us do have contracts with multiple companies. And part of that is it may be a particular area of interest, but it also commonly is a way that we can keep our research teams running when NIH funds are kind of up and down and whatnot. And so it's It's very common in emergency medicine that people are doing a lot of diagnostic studies with different companies. Of course, that's a lot of what we do in emergency medicine, so that's a common area. And so I can tell you that my research team, for instance, right now, just to make sure we can keep the staffing we need, we do a fair amount of industry-related biomarker studies, et cetera. I think, again, though, there is a cautious, and it's particularly, this is partly speaking for myself when I was in your shoes a few years ago, but still as a reminder to myself, is that there's a lot of opportunities to do industry, be a site PI for industry studies, and particularly during COVID, my email box was just filled every week with new study opportunities. But I trained in both emergency medicine and internal medicine, so you already know that I don't have the best focus necessarily. But that particularly, there's lots of sparkly, money opportunities out there with participating studies. But again, speaking of myself, but maybe as some advice is, try to stay focused on the area of research that you want to do and not get pulled away by tons of projects that may not actually, align with what your future goals are. They might bring some money to your institution, but ultimately, I think a lot of us are here because we want to do research that's going to change emergency medicine, and it's in an area that we're actually interested in. And believe me, I've gotten involved in some projects that weren't all that interesting in the past. So the real meat of today, though, is Jeremy's going to talk to you all about NIH awards. And so I'm not going to go into any of that, but I will cover a little bit about federal grants, and some of these you've already heard about, that you all can consider over the next few years. So the first is from AHRQ. I think we heard a number of people have had Ahrq funding. How many people had AHRQ funding? Yeah. So a couple of people, feel free to pick their brains if this is in your wheelhouse. But AHRQ mainly funds health services research, and it uses the same kind of NIH mechanisms for funding, which Jeremy will talk a little bit more about that the next talk, but it's not exactly NIH. And they also have both career development awards as well as large project research grants. This is just one example of some K08. K08 is their career development award. Nick Moore at the University of Iowa had a K08 looking at telehealth and sepsis care. He'll be at the meeting if anyone wants to pick his brain, although not here today. And then Elizabeth Schoenfield from UMass also had a K08 through Ahrq that was looking at barriers and facilitators of initiating buprenorphine in the ED, so more along the lines of opiate use disorder. Scott mentioned DOD. DOD also funds a number of emergency physicians, as well as BARDA. It's a different mechanism to apply. If you need help, don't look at me. Go to Scott for help applying to these. But some emergency physicians have really made a fair amount of their career off of DOD funding in the past. A couple recent ones. Well, John Holcomb's not emergency medicine, but I think we all know him as a trauma resuscitation researcher. He has DOD funding to look at next generation REBOA. Hakam Tiba, that's over at Michigan, has funding to look at non-invasive cerebrovascular monitoring. So all these things have a similar theme. These are all grants around trauma resuscitation, emergency response type stuff, but TBI is another big area, and I know, and sometimes these can be combined with NIH funding as well. So for instance, one of the people at North Carolina named Sam McLean had a large NIH-funded trial called Aurora that looked at biomarkers of TBI, but also received DOD funding on top of that because it was of interest to the DOD and allowed them to do more stuff in that area. I think this might be the last area is PCORI. PCORI has also become a common funding agency for emergency medicine. It's federally sponsored but separate from the NIH and whatnot, and primarily does comparative clinical effectiveness research. So a great example, actually, many of you probably saw the CODA study that was published within the last 2 years, which randomized patients to antibiotics versus surgery for acute appendicitis. That was funded by PCORI, so comparative effectiveness, looking at these two different treatment strategies for appendicitis. And one of the main investigators on there was Dave Talon, who's an emergency physician, and I think is getting like the research award this week. So that's a good example of like something that's within the wheelhouse of PCORI. So it's more, again, it's more on the clinical effectiveness research, comparative, and looking at patient-centered outcomes. So I'll give a couple examples. One is Zach Mizell, who's part of SAEM and at UPenn, had funding from PCORI to look at comparing ways to help patients with acute pain make treatment decisions. And that was some of that work was published recently. Another example is Sean Collins and a group out of Vanderbilt have a project called Guided Heart Failure, which we're one of their main sites up in Detroit, where we're using either mobile integrated health or care coaches that'll go to the homes of patients after an ED visit for acute heart failure, and then do further follow-up calls to see if this kind of implementation strategy will reduce repeat ED visits and whatnot for patients with heart failure. So how do you find out about all these grants? Well, hopefully your institution and your mentors will have a lot of that information for you to help out. There's also, your institution may participate in or may have subscription to Pivot or other resources for searching for such grants. You can also subscribe to different listservs that'll keep you updated on different grants. Particularly the NIH Guide for Grants and Contracts listserv both has NIH opportunities. It usually has AHRQ opportunities in there. PCORI also has a listserv that you can subscribe to that they send you, emails regularly for you to get updates on that. I'll give 2 quick plugs before closing. One is for 2 articles. One is Emergency Medicine Research 2030 Strategic Goals. Is a great one and really highlights you all and the fact that you are part of that strategic goal and that you have some amazing opportunities ahead of you to improve the emergency medicine research landscape. And the other one's a little older, called Research in Emergency Medicine, Building the Investigator Pipeline by Roger Lewis and Bob Newmar, and I encourage you to take a look at that one too. Just some great ways to see where you all fit in to all the incredible opportunities for change in emergency care and the science of what we do. And so thank you for your interest in grant funding and trying to push forward some amazing stuff that emergency medicine is doing. So with that, I think we probably have a couple of minutes for questions, but there's all day to talk about grant opportunities and whatnot with all the different faculty here. So any questions? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very common that, and I think, well, let me ask, how many faculty have put in kind of the same grant topic to 2 agencies at about the same time? Yeah, so it's fairly common. There does have to be transparency, and potentially there's the possibility that if you got funded for both at the same time, you'd have to seed the grants depending on the arrangement. But yeah, it's kind of expected, and it's also, you may find the agency that fits best, but still apply to something else as a backup.
I'll just add to that it's like totally fine to have multiple focus on the same topic, just not have multiple grants to use. So it's a really good problem to have.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, everyone.